associated with themes, right?
True.
So ghosts and sharks and mythological creatures and Norse mythology. But what this is used for is to create a culture around those weapon systems. But what I expect to happen in the not too distant future is we're going to start seeing a lot more Space Force weapon systems than we were tracking before.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. This week, the Space Force turns 6 years old, and because it's so young, it's still developing, still shaping its role in the joint force, still defining its responsibilities. And against that backdrop, the Space Force Association has been evolving too, figuring out how it supports the service branch and guardians. And nowhere is that more on display than at the annual Spacepower Conference in Orlando, Florida. The first year, that was 2023, the Spacepower Conference was cute and sweet. Last year, attendance and exhibitors more than doubled, forcing the association to find a venue that could grow with the event. This year, the footprint doubled again, possibly tripled. I don't have the hard numbers, but you'd have to be blind not to notice. What's more, at this event, the association hosted its first Secretary of the Department of the Air Force, a clear sign of just how important this meeting and the SFA have become. To analyze what out of this Space Power Conference was strategic, I enlisted the Mitchell Institute's new director of its Space Power Advantage Center of Excellence. He's a familiar voice to the Downlink audience. He's U.S. Space Force Colonel, retired Charles Galbreath. But before we get to our conversation, I want to acknowledge that a military-focused conference presents a buffet of acronyms that may not always be known outside of this community. You'll hear SWAC or SWAC. That's the Space Warfighting Analysis Center. Its responsibility is to wrestle with the known and the unknown future of warfare in the space domain and how the Space Force should prepare for it. And PME, that stands for Professional Military Education. PME is the training and schooling service members receive throughout their careers. Key aspects of this education are distinct to a military service branch's operational domain. For example, Navy education concerns itself mostly with the maritime domain. If there are more acronyms that remain unexplained, I beg your forgiveness. Now, here's my conversation with Charles. Hey, Charles, thanks so much for making the time to come on the podcast.
Laura, it's great to be back with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Are you kidding me? You are saving my bacon here at the Space Power Conference and helping me translate, what I think I heard.
So there's been a lot coming out, actually, the past couple of days, at least that I've heard. And I think maybe more so on day 2 than day 1, which might be a surprise to many of our listeners.
Interesting. All right. Well, before we get to that, right, you've been on the podcast a number of times, but we get new listeners all the time. So it would be really great if you could take a minute and introduce yourself and deliver a bit of news about yourself.
Yeah. So I'm Charles Galbreath. I am the director of the Mitchell Institute's Space Power Advantage Center of Excellence. Woohoo! I've been with the Mitchell Institute for almost 3 years now, and the title of director for MI Space is official as of this week, so I'm thrilled with that. We've got a great team at the Mitchell Institute, writing papers and doing some thought leadership, and I've been kind of performing the duties of the acting director for the better part of the past 2 years. But now we have 3 full-time fellows, including myself. And so it was time to say, okay, we actually have a director who, works to organize where we're heading as MI Space for the next year and working our strategic partnerships, as well as supporting the Air and Space Forces Association in their quest to equalize air and space in their mission. And so I'm really thrilled to be working with Burton Stutz, the president and vice president of the Air and Space Force Association, on a regular basis to advocate for Guardians and Spacepower. And of course, my role within the Mitchell Institute has just expanded a little bit because, I'm going to still write papers. And as we were talking about earlier, I'm putting out quite a few. Just did one last month. Maybe we'll talk about that more later. And then one of my colleagues, Jen Reeves, just had one come out earlier this week. So we're cranking through stuff. And we brought on Kyle Pumroy. And so he joined us in October, and he's already off and running on the project. So
congratulations.
Thank you very much.
That's really great news. That's just wonderful.
Thank you.
I know that yesterday morning, early, we both were in the dark main stage room, and it was really dark in there, and we both listened to the keynotes, right? But before we even get into the keynotes and kind of what was said, I mean, this is the third Spacepower conference, the first one under this administration. But what I think is actually quite notable is that this is the first time a secretary of the Department of the Air Force under any administration has attended this event. And I'm not trying to be unfair because in 2023, the first one, the event was new. Yeah. And so it was understandable that there was no SecAF. And to be quite honest, there weren't many journalists either. I was here, but, there weren't. It was like me and Teresa Hitchens, and it was fun. We had the place to ourselves, but, yeah. 2024, though, this really blossomed into a massive event, but no SecAF. And it is notable that Troy Munk, the new SecAF, he made the trip, and he addressed Space Force Guardians this year. So in your estimation, I'd like to know, how big of a deal is that, and what does that mean?
So I do think it's a big deal because having the Department of the Air Force and at the Secretariat level represented here shows the commitment that Secretary Mink has for not just the air side, but also the space side.
But he's a space-minded guy anyway. So we kind of expected him.
He is definitely a space-minded guy, but he also has a strong air background, right? And I feel kind of weird as a space guy reminding people that the secretary has some air background as well. But he does. He's got both. Certainly much more on the space side recently. And, just coming from the NRO, he definitely has that at the front of mind. But coming to an organization like the Space Force Association to speak about issues facing Guardians and focus his comments exclusively on that and where the department is and where the Space Force is and where they're heading, that's a big deal. And so I congratulate the Space Force Association on being able to bring in the Secretary of the Air Force to speak. And I hope this is not the last time this. I hope it continues, and I hope that it continues to grow.
And more involvement.
Absolutely.
Because I think this conference is going to grow.
I'm sure it is.
This is year 3, and I was just told by a conference type of expert person that says that conferences grow exponentially in the first 5 years. And then after year 5, then it kind of, you haven't hit your high water mark, right, but that your growth is a bit more steady as opposed to leaps and bounds.
That's
right?
Interesting.
Yeah, I didn't know that either, but I heard that yesterday from somebody who is an organizer of this conference, and that's, what the projection and the understanding is. However, I'd like to get your take on what Troy Munk said. Now, he spoke a lot about working together, integrating missions across services for the joint force and the joint fight, which isn't exactly new, just to be honest. And he did have a lot to say about acquisition reform, both on stage, but also in the presser. And the thing is, we hear this kind of every year. I mean, I hate to be such a pill, but maybe this time is different about acquisition and acquisition reform. But before I, get into that, what do you think that stood out in that keynote that you think is strategic?
So, one, I think just his presence is strategic messaging in and of itself.
True.
So I'll start there. But, his comments about acquisition reform, I think that's a strong plank for him to stand on because of his background, because of the direction coming out of the Office of the Secretary of War recently and the acquisition transformation strategy that was rolled out in November. What we're seeing is a lot of the initiatives that the Space Force has already put into motion earlier this year are codified in that strategy. And so in many ways, the Space Force has a leg up on many of the other services in terms of implementing that acquisition strategy.
True. So, but before I let you go on, I hate to cut you off, sorry, but, why don't we play a clip from the press conference? Because that was asked, and he spoke about it.
First off, the fact that SQ and AQ are working hard to get that done, but that doesn't affect the defining the architecture and the processes that we're going to use to do this. The great news is, and you probably heard me mention it, this is kind of a generational opportunity to improve acquisition across the board. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of great activities in acquisition right now, but there's always room for improvement. And I think this is both from the president through Congress to Secretary of War, who pulled us all together to talk about it, on down to the DepSecDef to the leadership team across the department. It's a big focus trying to make sure that we get this right, considering it is a generational opportunity. I've been doing this a long time. You probably heard me talk a little bit earlier. Is whoever's in charge of these portfolios, we need to make sure they have the authority, the resources, and the talent to execute. If you don't have that, almost every program that's gone well, regardless of the service, that was in place. Almost every program that has not gone well, that wasn't in place. So I'm going to be focused on structuring it, and that's how we manage the career field. That's the longevity of the people we put in as the portfolio acquisition executives. Everything that we do to support those is going to be to make sure that happens going forward.
So is this a generational opportunity? Like, what does it even mean, right? I asked someone from Space Systems Command this morning to explain it, and I hate to say this, the answer was a little bit tortured, but I have a feeling that maybe you have a strategic view on that.
So I do. And here it is.
Phew, thank goodness. Because I was thought, I've been hearing this over and over again, and I just, what does this mean?
So there have been, for your audience and for the folks that maybe don't know me, 30 years in the Air Force and Space Force, at least 15 of that doing space acquisitions. So space acquisitions is near and dear to my heart. So the desire to transform space acquisitions, to make it more affordable and to increase the timeline that we can deliver capabilities more rapidly, that has been an enduring goal for at least the past 15, if not 20 years or more. All right, so you've got that. But then there's another lens that you have to look at, and that is Congress. Congress has said for many years, we need to transform the way we do space acquisitions. But they haven't offered anything concrete in terms of, well, what do you really want us to do? And at the same time, you've got people in OSD, a third lens, now OSW, saying...
This is the Office of the Secretary of Defense or the Office of the Secretary of War, right, depending upon what your profession is.
Right. And all of the different offices underneath that focus on acquisition activities. They are now also saying, yes, we need to transform, and here's some concrete recommendations. And you've got the president saying we need to transform. So there's this confluence of all of these leadership aspects that are saying now is the right time to transform, and here are some concrete steps that we can take to do so. And what you see in the acquisition transformation strategy in terms of leveraging commercial, in terms of portfolio management, in terms of budget flexibility, in terms of having a greater cross-flow of personnel between the government and industry to strengthen that relationship. These are things that the Space Force has been implementing, and trying to get into the mainstream for a while now, using other transaction authorities rather than the large, typical contracts, leveraging the commercial technologies that are fielded not because the government said, I want you to go do this, but because someone in the industry said there's a need for this and I'm going to go do it. And rather than using government funds to do so, they're getting venture capital, private equity to develop these capabilities. So we could go off on a whole tangent about what is commercial and how are we trying to exploit that. But all of those aspects, so space acquisition, Congress, the Pentagon, OSW, OSD, as well as the administration, all simultaneously saying this is the right time to do this. And, we've got some acts in Congress recommending some speed in the Forge Act that are looking to accelerate acquisitions. And so I think this is a unique opportunity. Is it a generational opportunity? Maybe, but it is a unique opportunity, and I think the Space Force is at the leading edge of taking advantage of it.
So to move on to what Salty said, personally, I felt that it was a lot more informative what he said in the presser than the keynote. And the keynote was fit for what it's supposed to be. I mean, he was talking to the Guardians and giving them a report card on the things that, have been done over the past 12 months. That's all cool. But I felt that, what he said to us as in the journalists, because we're a different crowd, we started speaking about the future. And the CSO said that the Space Futures Command is not dead, which a lot of people I know had really feared that it was, because it was supposed to become something in September. Then we heard that it was going to be coming in November. And then it just sort of disappeared. And we heard about 2 papers, and those papers haven't come out, but they're going to come out, except everything just keeps going to the right. But however, he said, it's coming. So let's take a listen to what he actually said about that.
I get it wrong, but so as you'll recall, when the initial reoptimization efforts are being rolled out, there was an acknowledgement that the Space Force was really created around that pacing threat. And so a lot of what we were doing was already engineered around, designed around that thought process. And so we had a little bit of a jump start on the Air Force. The Air Force also had a lot more that they needed to do to make that pivot. So they had a lot more to think through, a lot more planning that was required. We were doing things like service components and different officer training, and we got ahead of the curve on that. And so we're keeping all of it because it's all just a natural part of the Space Force evolution since our inception, if you will. I think the last thing we have to put in place is this, what we were calling Futures Command. And the secretary kind of started quizzing me on it when he came in. And what it turns out is we realized that the Space Warfighting Analysis Center is really the heart and soul of what we were thinking about for futures. The work that they've done to identify what architectures were required to perform the missions. And what we were really doing is just expanding that out to include other operational concepts around new missions and doing the wargaming and simulations at higher fidelity than what we were getting from Space Warfighting Analysis Center. So really, it just kind of became an expansion of that capability to add a few more activities to it. And so we basically just kind of reframed what that command would look like. And now we're doing the mission analysis to figure out how many people and where are they going to be and what are the specific workflows. And my goal is that this will be an activity that we close out in 26. But again, all of our re-optimization was really just the optimization and evolution of the Space Force. I miss anything?
So Futures Command is being framed as a natural progression and as part of a re-optimizing of the Space Force. And from what had been prior to the service branch being established, you write a lot about the future and you conduct workshops about the future. Yeah. So I want to know first, how important is the establishment of this command to you? Do we even need it? Maybe we don't. I mean, there have been arguments against it, and I'm not an expert. That's why I have you. And what does it really need to do if we do need it?
So I do think establishing a Futures Command is important. And I say that because you've probably heard the expression, where you stand depends on where you sit. Well, if you don't sit in an organization that's called Futures Command, it's hard for you to stand for what the future of the Space Force needs to be. So I think from an institutional perspective, there is value in having an organization that is focused on where the Space Force needs to go in the future. That said, what they will do didn't ever go away, right? And I think when General Saltzman talked at Airspace and Cyber Conference back in September, he talked about the objective force architecture that would be coming out soon.
And an objective force architecture really means in English.
Well, it really, I was getting there.
Well, I'm sorry.
No,
I mean,
that's
I know
okay.
what it is,
Yeah.
but it's, I mean,
where do we need to be 15 years from now as a service?
and how many people need to be doing what, and
what
kind
type of capabilities?
skills, and- okay.
Right. All of those things that we aspire the service to be in 15 years. And then you could take a look at, well, where are we today? The operational force, and you look at the delta, well, that's where we need to be investing our resources to either develop new capabilities or new training or get additional personnel to bring in to actually do the mission. So the objective force architecture is a document that will be coming out hopefully very soon that is a key element of what a futures command would need to do. And they're able to do that because there are people in the headquarters working in the 5 and the 8 that are looking beyond the FIDEP, the Future Year Defense Plan.
Right.
Right.
Close enough.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are people at the Space Warfighting and Analysis Center, the SWAC, that are also looking at objective force designs, and they've done multiple studies to look at each of the different mission areas to say, okay, what do I need to do in the future based off of the threat environment? And so even if there isn't a futures command, the function will still get performed. I think it'll be more effective, and I think the personnel will have an easier job of doing their job if a futures command exists. And so I'm really happy to hear that it is potentially going to exist. I want to highlight a couple things, though, that he did say on the main stage that I thought were really interesting. And then I also want to circle back to a new document that came out, the Vector. I do want to highlight that. So on stage, he talked about a captain's professional education for Guardians. So up till now, the Air Force Airmen and Space Force Guardians have all been going to Squadron Officer School as a captain. That's their PME. But now it was announced that Texas A&M is going to be hosting the Space Captain's course starting in January. So I think having unique PME that is tailored to Guardians and what they need to be in terms of space power advocates and understanding what their service does, why they do it, so that when they go to joint PME in the future, they can express the service's position and they understand it and they've debated it amongst themselves, and it helps refine how the service evolves, which brings me to the second thing he said on stage, and it was a naming convention. And for those that haven't seen it, look at the graphics. There are 7 mission areas that all have new naming conventions associated with them. Themes, right?
True.
So ghosts and sharks and mythological creatures and Norse mythology. But what this is used for is to create a culture around those weapon systems. But what I expect to happen in the not too distant future is we're going to start seeing a lot more Space Force weapon systems than we were tracking before.
It's a very interesting read on that, because why go through the trouble of trying to figure out these naming conventions unless you're actually going to have something to name?
Right. If you have one weapon system, you don't need to create a whole theme for naming that one weapon system. But if you've got 5 or 6 that do electronic warfare, for example, well, then maybe that's worthwhile. So I do expect in 26 that some more information will be rolling out along these themes to identify some of the capabilities. And I bring this up because the Air and Space Forces magazine every year puts out an almanac. And we worked pretty hard this year to make sure that there was a more detailed representation of the Space Force weapon systems, right? If you look at past issues, you've got Air Force fighters, Air Force bombers, Air Force EW, Air Force lift, et cetera, and then you have Space Force all lumped together. Well, so this most recent edition, we broke it out by different mission areas within the Space Force, and we went to a lot more detail. The next iteration of this is going to be even more expansive, I think, because of some of the acknowledgments that are going to come out as a result of this naming convention. So it's not just a shiny, flashy sticker.
Do you think it's going to get out of being in classified land?
I think there will be some that come out of classified land, but I also think it's going to be just an acknowledgement of some of the different capabilities that many people don't really associate with the Space Force or understand in a nuanced way that I think will emerge as a result of this.
All right. So here we are in December in Orlando with Space Force Guardians everywhere. Can't swing a cat without hitting a Guardian, right? And we are
You shouldn't swing cats, but there are a lot of Guardians here.
That's true. There are a lot of Guardians here, and we are very close. We're just days away from the Space Force's 6th birthday.
Yes.
So we are now in the 6th year, and there has been a shift in the kinds of words that are used. It's much more, military, right?
How about that?
I know, right? Who knew? But that, words like destroy or offensive operations could be controversial or spicy.
Yep.
But hey, they're now being used. And that really does, speak to culture.
Yes.
It's not just about supporting the joint force or being, as I like to say, Verizon over the horizon, right? But actually, protecting space assets. And providing a deterrent factor, holding assets at risk of an opponent. So it's becoming more distinct and recognized as a branch of the military. But I think it might be interesting to have a quick listen to what Chief Master Sergeant John Bentavania had to say when I asked him about culture.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the questions so far have been, General Saltzman talks about, as a service, we have design, develop, generate, and employ. And a lot of the questions so far have kind of been on the design side. So this is more of the how are we developing, how are we generating forces, and how are we employing. And it has been an amazing year. So how's it changed? I think Guardians have a much, with the space, the warfighting framework that we put out, talking about doctrine of what our core functions, enterprise functions that we're doing as a service. I think as we define those things, Guardians at the tactical level have a much greater understanding of how and why we need to achieve space superiority. So I think that they're much more attuned and much more focused on where they're going. And I think you saw that in Resolute Space, which was the big exercise we had this summer, where we presented forces with hard tactical problems, and the Guardians had focused. They knew exactly what they had to get after and why, where they fit into the joint force. And as talked about, where space is so underpinning to all the other lethalities for all the other domains that we have. So I think little by little, as we're defining it, talking about it, integrating it, the Guardians are latching onto and have a much better understanding. So that development, the generation, and employment of Guardians, those other things that you're specifically talking about, have seen strides this year.
Okay, so Charles, you work with a lot of Guardians. I mean, you're on the phone with them all the time. Yeah. Right? And you listen to them day in, day out. What shifts in culture have you seen? And what's left to do in terms of building Guardian culture and its traditions?
Yeah, so I do. I get the pleasure and the honor of talking with Guardians on a regular basis. And it is amazing to see. And I think there's an element to the culture that could get overlooked, and that's the generational aspect. Secretary Mink, when he was on stage yesterday, talked about space as a warfighting domain, and he admitted that he's still a little uncomfortable talking about things like that and talking about offensive capability because for so many years, he wasn't able to talk about it.
Verizon over the horizon.
Right?
Yep.
And so when General Saltzman talked, he talked about our competitors, right? And about, and he's talked before about the enduring competition we have with China and them as competitors. Let me give you another data point. Today, General Gagnon, who just took over Combat Forces Command, talked about the PLA as an enemy, and it's an enemy he hates because they stand for things that he doesn't stand for. So there's some changing language there. And the fact that they've renamed Space Operations Command to Combat Forces Command is also significant. And I think General Gagnon's comments about why that happened were also very telling. It's not what is changing today. It's what has been changing over the past several years that now enables them to be called Combat Forces Command, and how their efforts are focused on not just protecting and defending, but that the Space Force needs to shift to be something new where it's protect, defend, and attack. So I think General Gagnon's leaning even further ahead of some of this cultural mindset about, yes, we're a military service. We're a part of the profession of arms, and lives are at stake, and we're going to be able to affect lethal and non-lethal actions as a result of what Guardians do.
provide a deterrence, and that if in the case that you actually have
absolutely.
to hold and put an
Absolutely.
asset of an adversary at risk, that we have the capability and the will to do so.
Yeah, and General Gagnon talked about the people are our power in combat forces, in combat forces command. And so the culture is going to continue to evolve. Think of the Space Force not as an entity, but as a living organism. It's just turning 6. It's going to continue to grow, and it's going to continue to evolve, and its culture is going to continue to evolve. This warfighting mindset, though, I want to just come back on a couple other comments that were made. Chief Bitavenia's stage comments talked about the first thing to break the Kármán line that was launched by man was a weapon. A lot of people don't, make that connection. But the Nazis in World War II launched V-2s, weapons, that went into space. General Whiting, the commander of U.S. Space Command, in his keynote address, talked about the mythology that space was ever peaceful. It's always irked me when people say space is a benign environment. Space is not a benign environment. It's
radioactive.
It's got radiation. It's got extreme temperatures. There's micrometeorites.
Yeah.
It's not a benign environment. It is a hostile environment, but it's a naturally hostile environment. Mankind has also made it, intentionally hostile.
Well, we bring our own baggage.
We bring our
with
own
us.
stuff. And as Chief Bitavenia said, in every domain where man has gone, we have fought. And we should not expect space to be any different. General Whiting's comments were basically space has never been a peaceful domain. It's always been part of our warfighting mindset. It's always supported either nuclear stability or the ability to prosecute a nuclear war if need be. And so that mythology that space was ever peaceful is not a state that we can hope to return to if we just leave things alone. We have to be prepared. And that's the best way to deter that fight from ever happening, is to be prepared to not only fight, but also to win.
All right, so we are running out of time, but I think there's actually a really important piece or article that came from Defense One, and that was yesterday, and it's out of Washington, D.C., and it describes a problem Congress has identified. And it did so last year, and lawmakers don't seem to be satisfied with some actions from the Space Force. Their view is that 6 years after the Space Force was established, operators have been placed at the top of the Space Force pecking order. So this is a culture and a traditional sort of debate. And that these operators being at the top of the pecking order, it's to the detriment of other career paths, such as acquisitions or acquirers or cyber warriors. They specifically point to acquisitions, though, and these same lawmakers, almost a year ago, they warned the Space Force that they wanted something done. And we have, new systems deltas, which are intended to integrate requirements, generators, and acquisitions officers into operational units. And that started in August. But lawmakers don't seem to think that that really is the complete answer. Because according to the Defense One article, the House version of the 2026 Defense Authorization Act will require the Space Force to have the same number of operators as acquisition officers. And that's pretty darn prescriptive. And I'm bringing this all up to you because I'm not really sure what to make of it. It seems like the Space Force is trying, but maybe what's been done in terms of training and career specialties and career advancement for those who are not operators, maybe it's not close to what Congress has envisaged, or maybe even what's needed. So I'd love it if you could just kind of hey, Charles, what's going on here?
Okay.
What's the argument?
So I think there's a lot going on here.
Okay. All
And,
right.
And as a former Guardian who was a 13S operator, but spent most of my time doing acquisition, right? I have been a strong proponent of the integration of operations and acquisition communities within the space arena for my whole career. And I base that opinion on the fact that so much more of the life cycle costs of a space weapon system occurs prior to launch in the acquisition realm than it does in the sustainment side after launch, or in the operations side. Also, space is a little more technical than any other warfighting domain, and that often leads to folks with advanced academic degrees that are more engineering or science-based, and those typically are found in the acquisition community as well, especially in the 6-2 career field. So that's why I believe the integration is critical, and perhaps many in Congress see something similar. I'll say this, though. The percentage of officer guardians that have an acquisition career field is roughly 40%, right? So the Space Force already consists of a lot of acquisition folks. So I don't know if mandating a certain level of people within the Space Force need to be acquisition or otherwise makes a lot of sense. Now let's talk about the senior leadership of the Space Force. Well, the Space Force number 2 was General Gutlein for a long time until he got pulled into Golden Dome. General Bythewood just took over Space Force's space. He's an acquisition guy. General Gagnon just took over Combat Forces Command. He's an intelligence officer. And so there are opportunities for non-operators in senior leadership positions in the Space Force beyond just Space Systems Command and the great work General Garant is doing.
So it's happening.
I think it is happening. Star Command, previously, General Sheba, another acquirer. And so there are opportunities for senior leaders to progress. Now, will we see a chief of space operations that's been a core acquirer for the majority of their career? Maybe. But how often do we see a chief of staff of the Air Force that was an acquirer?
True, but the thing is, we want Space Force to be different than Air Force, right?
Well, any of the military services, they're typically run by their operational, their warfighting personnel. And maybe that's because they've seen exactly how they need to employ for combat, and they've seen that side of things, right? The role of a service is to organize, train, and equip. Organize, train, and equip for what? To fight and to win. You do that by having experience at fighting and winning. That comes from the operational side. Now, there's some great strategic thinkers on the acquisition side as well. And again, I strongly advocate for the greater cross-flow of experience between operators and acquirers. I think having an OpEx experience first, an operational experience assignment first, makes a lot of sense. I think getting ACX experience for a lot of operators makes a lot of sense too. How much better would you be as an operator of a particular weapon system if you knew what went into the creation, the development, and the manufacture of that weapon system? You know it inside and out, right? So I think there's a lot to be said for greater integration. And over time, maybe we will see a chief of space operations that has done a little of both, right?
Or intelligence.
Or intelligence, or cyber.
Right.
Right?
I mean,
so I think there's potential growth for non-space operations career fields for continued leadership opportunities in the Space Force.
Charles, we have run out of time. So just thank you so much for joining me here in Orlando, Florida at the Spacepower Conference. And we got to have you back on soon.
Yeah. Thanks, Laura. It's always great to be with you. Congratulations to the Space Force Association on a great conference. And to all the Guardians out there, Semper Supra.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello. And get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.